the third, fourth, and fifth generation, also known as the start of Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation. Right after the video game crash in 1983, what happened during that time, and how did it lead to a turnaround? Let's find out today on Feed My Curiosity. On the last episode of Feed My Curiosity, we started our trip back in time to look at some of the very first video game consoles to ever hit the market. The first generation of consoles brought us the Brown Box, Pong, and the Coleco Telstar, while the second generation spawned the Channel F, the Mattel Intellivision, and the Atari 2600. On today's episode, we'll take a look at the video game crash of 1983 and how it not only gave rise to the third and fourth generation of consoles, but to some familiar names we still love today, like Sega, Nintendo, and PlayStation. If you like learning about science, technology, history, and tons of other subjects, don't forget to help us grow and show your support for Feed My Curiosity by pressing the subscribe button. By 1983, the video game industry was booming. Revenue was up as high as $3.2 billion a year. New consoles were coming out all the time. You could choose the Atari 5200, the Emerson Arcadia, the Intellivision 2, just to name a few, each with their own exclusive games. The options were nearly endless. However, by 1985, things began to take a turn for the worse. Revenue peaked at $100 million, down 97% from its $3.2 billion just 2 years prior. Many video game companies ended up closing, and people thought the end of video game consoles was nigh. But exactly what contributed to this crash? One large factor was that the market was flooded with too many different consoles. Besides the Atari 5200, the Emerson Arcadia, the Intellivision 2, there was nearly an endless supply of other consoles to choose from, like the Sears Telegames, the Odyssey Squared, the Bally Astrocade, the Vectrex, the ColecoVision, and the Coleco Gemini. If your friends had different consoles, then you couldn't share games, which meant you'd often end up playing alone. As video game companies competed to be the best, their focus shifted to quantity over quality, rushing to release as many games as possible without worrying about if it was any good. An infamous example of a game made during this time was E.T. the Extraterrestrial for the Atari 2600. In order to have it available for the 1982 Christmas season, the development team was given only 6 months to create, test, and market the game.
And everybody's going, and everybody started talking about, well, that's going to be a big royalty thing, and that's going to get a lot of hype and stuff like this, and people are mumbling. And so I just stood up and I said, anybody else who would like to do this game in 6 weeks, raise your hand. I said, I will let you do the game. I said, I don't have to do this game. I said, if you want to do this game, go ahead. Who would like to do E.T.? Nobody raised their hand. So I said, okay, I'll do E.T.
When the game became a massive failure, all unsold cartridges were secretly buried in the desert somewhere in New Mexico. Around 728,000 cartridges, that included E.T. and other games, were buried. As you can see, Atari, one of the leaders in the video game industry at the time, were also leaders in the video game crash, which is why it is also dubbed the Atari crash. Another reason behind the video game crash was the rise of the personal computer. During the time, many companies like Apple and Microsoft were actively developing computer hardware and applications. Computers were priced around the same as video game consoles, making it an easy choice for consumers, since a PC could not only play video games, but also do plenty of things that consoles couldn't. With many critics writing their early obituaries for video game consoles, someone had to step in and save the industry. Before we get to who it was, let's take a pop quiz. Which video game console was E.T. the Extraterrestrial developed for? A. Mattel Intellivision, B. Atari 2600, C. ColecoVision, D. Microsoft Windows. Do you think you know the answer? Leave it in the comments below. In 1983, Nintendo had released their console, the Family Computer, or the Famicom in Japan. It was the #1 console to own, and nearly every household in Japan had one. The cartridge-based console also had a microphone built into the second player's controller because Masayuki Umera wanted to take advantage of the karaoke boom in Japan at the time. However, the microphone was most famously used for Will Wright's raid on Boojling Bay, which players could use it to call for help. While expanding globally, Nintendo knew they wouldn't have the same kind of console exclusively in North America. Before tapping into the North American market with the Famicom, they first relieved the stores of unsold games and consoles by buying them back. The next thing they did was develop the Robotic Operating Buddy, also known as ROB, a toy accessory for their console that could be used for two of its games, Stack Up and Gyromite. Finally, they redesigned the Famicom, including changing the color scheme from red to gray. The resulting console was one that many of us are familiar with today, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES for short. It was released in North America in 1985 and became an instant success, starting the third generation of video game consoles. The console introduced games like Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Final Fantasy, Castlevania, and Mega Man. To prevent unauthorized companies from producing NES games without Nintendo's permission, they introduced a checking integrated circuit, or the CIC, in their video game cartridges. This way, cartridges without the CIC would simply not work with the NES. Other video game consoles that were developed as a part of the third generation included the Sega Master System. Originally released in Japan in 1985 as the Sega Mark III, it was brought over to North America in 1986 under the name Sega Master System. However, it never outshined the NES and forever stayed in its shadow.
The challenge is ice hockey. The power is Nintendo. It's as slick as ice, as fast as fury. Throw in your shoulder, dig in your blade, blast it in, or be blown away. Ice hockey only from Nintendo.
One big reason for this was that Nintendo had made deals with third-party developers, preventing them from making games for any other console. In other words, companies that were making games for the NES couldn't make games for Sega. The Sega Master System still managed to do better than the Atari 7800, another new console released in 1986. Despite using the same sound chip as the 2600, it had improved graphics and also had backwards compatibility with games made for the 2600. Updated versions of popular Atari titles such as Pac-Man, Food Fight, and Pole Position were released for the 7800, but there weren't many new games made beyond that. The fourth generation of video game consoles began when Hudson Soft and NEC Corporation released PC Engine in Japan in 1987 and 1989 in North America as TurboGrafx 16. With an 8-bit CPU and a dual 16-bit GPU, it was able to simultaneously display up to 482 different colors. However, this console came with only one controller port, and consumers had to buy attachments for the console to be able to use more controllers. The TurboGrafx 16 quickly took a backseat to newer consoles like the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Compared to these two consoles, the TurboGrafx 16 only had 8 kilobytes of RAM, while the Genesis and Super Nintendo had 64 kilobytes. Compared to Sega and Nintendo, the TurboGrafx 16 just didn't have enough companies producing games for them, and they eventually bowed out. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, an 8-bit handheld video game console. Although other handheld consoles already existed up to this point, the Game Boy instantly became a successful handheld with 1 million units sold in the United States within weeks. That same year, the Sega Genesis was released in North America. Named after the Book of Genesis, it's known to be the first 16-bit video game console. In 1991, Sega introduced Sonic the Hedgehog, a fast-paced platformer game that became an instant hit, and many people would buy a Genesis just to play the game. Meanwhile, the Super Nintendo, also known as the SNES, was also released, another 16-bit console like the Sega Genesis. One of the most popular games Nintendo released for it was Super Mario All-Stars, which bundled 4 remastered versions of popular Super Mario titles: Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3, all with updated graphics and audio, as well as bug fixes. The third generation of video game consoles had revitalized the industry. With Nintendo leading the way, developers prioritized the quality of video games, and through technological innovations such as the CIC chip, unauthorized companies would not be able to make games for their consoles. The world had also been introduced to Super Mario, one of the most iconic video game characters to this day. The fourth generation of consoles introduced 16-bit gaming, as well as Sega's own mascot character, Sonic the Hedgehog. Looking ahead, the fifth generation of consoles introduced 3D graphics, optical disc game storage, and analog controllers. The fifth generation will be one of the topics covered in the next part of our series on the history of video game consoles. If you like learning about science, technology, history, and tons of other subjects, don't forget to help us grow and show your support for Feed My Curiosity by pressing the subscribe button. And now to the answer of our pop quiz. Which video game console was E.T. the Extraterrestrial developed for? If you said B, Atari 2600, congratulations, you were right. If you weren't, don't worry, you'll have another chance to show your knowledge of video game consoles in the next video. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Feed My Curiosity. We'll see you next week, where we'll finish off our 3-part series on the history of video game consoles. Take care.